So, before we begin with the full text reading and discussion of Hamlet by William Shakespeare, it's very important to understand the notion of a Shakespearean tragedy. In order to understand a Shakespearean tragedy, we need to understand that how did the genre of drama and the performance in theaters it started in the history of drama. So before moving on to Shakespearean tragedy, we are going to first discuss um, what were the beginning of the tragedy, how they were defined when this genre started. So without any further ado, let's move on to what was the concept of tragedy when this genre was taking shape in the ancient Greek Athens. So the genre of drama evolved in somewhere in 6th century BC in ancient Greece. And there we see at that time the civilization was flourishing, and the dramatic performances in the Athenian Greek festivals were one of the signs of all that civilization which was happening in Greek Athens in the time of Aristotle and Plato. So this first definition of tragedy, it came from Aristotle in his book Poetics, book 4. He defines tragedy as an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, in language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, several kinds being found in separate parts of the play in the form of action, not of narrative, through pity and fear effecting the proper purgation of these emotions. So, what this definition by Aristotle implies is that tragedy is first and foremost the representation of human action, and those actions represented in those tragedies have serious, often dire consequences, and the characters represented are of elevated social status. Plot is a complete coherent whole, lasting long enough to represent adequately the reversal of the hero's fortune. And these tragedies are written in a language which is composed and employs tropes and other heightened or unusual uses of speech and texture of different poetic meters. One very, very important factor or element of these tragedies is catharsis. The tragedy arouses pity and fear in the viewers and brings about catharsis. Now, when we'll move on with this lecture and we'll try to discuss what a Shakespearean tragedy is, we'll see many of the things they said by Aristotle about the tragedy. They are there in a Shakespearean tragedy as well. But Shakespeare treats his tragedy in his own way. Yes, the basic might be the same, what has been propounded by Aristotle, but he gave um, his own style to the tragic genre of drama when he was writing it. Before we move on to Shakespearean tragedy and Elizabethan playwrights, it's very important that we understand that there were some Greek playwrights in 6th century BC who were writing tragedies, and whose tragedies were later on followed by Seneca, a Roman playwright, and basically Seneca had the influence on Elizabethan drama. So the Greek playwrights who were writing in 6th century BC were Aeschylus, who wrote his trilogy, the Oresteia. Second playwright was Sophocles, whose plays Oedipus the King and Antigone are very popular, and which you most probably are going to study in 307 as well. And the third playwright was Euripides, who wrote Medea, Hippolytus, and so many other plays which you are going to get acquainted with in English 307. The Roman playwright Seneca then followed the principles and the writing style which these three Greek playwrights used, but mostly he followed Euripides, and he wrote plays in the same way Greek playwrights were writing. But what he added was he added a few of the things like the division of the play in 5 acts. He used very bombastic and very evocative language in order to express his opinion, and his plays were usually taught in Elizabethan times at schools. That's why it's very probable that Shakespeare had studied some of the plays written by Seneca, and he had a very strong influence on his writing style. So on Shakespeare, we see direct influence of Greek tragedians through Roman playwright Seneca. Seneca's plays were taught in the schools in Shakespearean times, and Elizabethan playwrights followed Seneca by adopting his ornamental language, long introspective speeches, which later on they were mastered and they were developed into very thought-provoking soliloquies used by both Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe, and asides, the five-act division, the elements of supernatural, and Shakespeare, especially in Hamlet, he followed the revenge tragedy tradition, which was first used by Thomas Kyd in his play The Spanish Tragedy. So finally, these are the resources for this lecture.